or not, every English male between the ages of 14 and 60 is required by law to practice archery every week. The law dates back to 1363, and before that, in 1252, another law said they had to arm themselves with a bow and arrows. Suffice to say that nobody today is being prosecuted for failure to observe this law. Now, when I came ashore after my first period as a cadet, one of our group found this law and decided a good idea on a Sunday afternoon that we went and fulfilled our obligation. And we found a pub that had the targets in the garden and gave out free bows and arrows to the customers. And we went along and did it. And I can guarantee you that the accuracy does not improve with the intake of alcohol. The underlying logic behind this law, of course, was to prepare for an invasion and have sufficiently armed men to defend the country. Now, in a maritime context, I couldn't find anything that went back to the 12th and 13th century, but still some of the regulations have been around for several years. And because we're in a safety forum, I decided to look at that one that has the most catastrophic consequences when things go wrong. It's a navigation incident. In fact, it represents the worst peacetime maritime disaster to date. It was the collision between the tanker Vector and the passenger ferry Donia Path, where in excess of 4,300 people lost their lives, most of them burnt alive in the water after the collision. Normally, when we have a collision, we considered it must be some fool who was unable to follow the regulations. However, during my observations carrying out navigational assessments over the last few years, I've decided now to look more carefully at the rules and question their ongoing effectiveness. Let us consider these rules were released in 1972 and came into effect in 1977. The people who wrote them were familiar with a VLCC just coming onto the scene. They were used to the radar only being used when you needed to, i.e. you were already in fog when you put the radar on. The current rules use the term look out. Now it's either a compound noun or a phrasal verb consisting of the word look, the verb, and the preposition out, look out, signifying visual. And the visual impact sticks with us despite all the advances in technology we now have on the modern bridge. Consider one of the normal reactions if a vessel enters in poor visibility. We say, call a lookout. We call somebody to come and look at something you can't see, instead of saying, call another qualified radar observer. So some of the logic of these existing rules has to be called into question. In 1970, this was the medium for recording and storing information, particularly music. That was followed by a CD. A USB stick. We've got cloud, yes, cloud music we can download from the cloud. And if we want to buy a new song, we just go onto our smartphone when we download it from iTunes or wherever. The same thing has happened on the ships, but people are not really aware of it. So we want a new chart. We go to our chart supplier and we ask for the code. They send us a code letter and we open up the ENC we need on board the ship. That technology is there now, right now. The consequences, of course, when they get it wrong, is a collision. It's very expensive. In fact, collisions create the most disastrous type of accidents going. The biggest pollution, the biggest loss of life, and the biggest P&I claims. I think the cost of wreck removal for the Costa Concordia was $2 billion. Pocket money? I think not. The problem is there is resistance to change. There are people today, despite being shown, etc., examples of where perhaps these things are not particularly good, they will reject any changes without thinking, could we not make them better? In 1970, there was one traffic separation scheme, as I remember, and that was in the Dover Strait. Look at how many there are today and the improvement that those have created. But along with them, they have created other problems, and that is bunching. It's like driving on the highway, yes, when you're doing a higher speed, but you're very close to cars all around you, and it doesn't take much of an incident with one vehicle to create a multiple accident. So it's just possible then that some of the existing COLREGS are no longer fit for purpose. But of course, something is coming along to buckle that resistance. Disruptive technology in the form of maritime autonomous surface ships, of which there are 4 classes. The first class is a traditionally manned vessel with technology to assist in decision-making. The second class is where you have people on board, but they don't keep the normal watches, but they are ready to respond in case they are needed. The third type is where you have a control room ashore and there is a controller directing the movement of the ship. And the fourth system is, I'm not quite sure how it works, but you just put in a chip and away the ship goes. Of course, that means there are so many things that have to change. The law's going to have to change. How the ship is dealt with in ports. STCW, how can that apply to a ship with nobody on board? The list is endless. But one of the obvious things that that unmanned ship cannot do is comply with COLREGS as they stand based on simple technology. How do you keep a lookout with no physical person on the ship? How do you respond to calls from emergencies with nobody on board the ship? How do you communicate with the ports when you are arriving? So no master, no crew, no lookout. What about who's going to hear any whistle signals which are mentioned in the current regulations? So if we need to make changes to accommodate mass, then why not change the COLREGS as a whole? To take into account the modern equipment, the cultures, etc., that exist today. There is so much more equipment on board the ship that gives a much more detailed analysis of the developing situation. And we would need support software to assist with that. And one thing that we could do, even with existing manned ships, is with the new equipment, we can actually reduce the physical size of the wheelhouse into rather like the control tower in an airport. So the extent is perhaps one radar, one egg this, one radar egg this, and there are the side windows, so that sat in one chair, I can rotate around, and I've got a full vision of the complete horizon almost. We could place more responsibility on small boat owners. I'm sure all small boat owners have these expensive smartphones, and a combined GPS and AIS unit for a small boat would probably cost less than the smartphone they have. And in so doing, then all vessels that are floating around the approaches to port and in the seas can be identified by instrumentation and not purely by the human eye. So changes then. Let us accept that Mars is a reality. Let us accept that there will still be manned ships going well into the future, and there will be a mix of both types. Let us accept that there will be decision assistance available for the officer of the watch on the manned vessel. and let us write a new set of rules in the culture of today's ship and equipment, and with an eye on the future. Because if we don't, we will end up with a new Red Flag Act. When cars first started to appear on the streets, the law said you must have somebody walking in front with a red flag to advise the horse-drawn vehicles so that the horses would not be scared and start jumping around. Thank you.